You're watching Southern Crimes.
December 13th, 2000, Key West, Florida. You're sitting in a waterfront bar, the warm Caribbean breeze carrying the scent of salt and freedom through the open windows. At 53 years old, you've finally found the life you've always dreamed of. Living on the water with a man who promised you adventure and a 5-year sailing tour around the world. Your phone call to a coworker is filled with excitement as you describe the plans for your global voyage aboard the Island Girl. The 55-foot schooner rocks gently in the harbor, and everything feels perfect, almost like a postcard from paradise. You've sold your condo, invested over $40,000 in this new life, and left behind everything familiar for the promise of endless horizons. Your sailing companion seems like everything he claimed to be: wealthy, educated, experienced on the water. But as you hang up the phone and prepare to return to the boat, you don't notice the way other locals avoid eye contact when they see you with him. You don't know about the woman who disappeared from his life in 1981, or the violent history hidden behind his charming smile. This will be the last conversation anyone has with you. Because in the Florida Keys, where the water is deep enough to hide secrets and boats can disappear beyond any horizon, well, some sailing companions aren't looking for adventure. They're looking for victims who won't be missed until it's far too late. This is Southern Crimes. Broward County, Florida, July 1973. The summer of 1973 in South Florida was a season of stifling humidity and a growing collective dread. In the coastal cities of Fort Lauderdale and Hollywood, the palm-lined streets became the backdrop for a series of murders that felt both random and terrifyingly specific. The media gave the killer several names, but the one that stuck was the Gold Sock Killer. It began on July 15th. Janina Kelpian, a 42-year-old Iceland native, was found in a residential yard just a mile from her home. She'd been assaulted and strangled from behind. The weapon was a man's gold knee-length stretch sock. In a chilling detail, her white Cadillac was found nearby, with her Cocker Spaniel, Sponge, still waiting unharmed in the back seat. 10 days later, a 25-year-old secretary in Fort Lauderdale was attacked in her apartment. An intruder lunged from the shadows and wrapped a gold sock around her neck. She fought back with enough ferocity to scare him off, later describing him as a thin, blonde-haired male in his 20s. The attacks didn't stop, but the signature evolved. In early August, 17-year-old Teresa Ann Williams was found in a Hollywood marsh. This time, the ligature was a maroon sock. By the end of the month, 16-year-old Mary Sue Curtis was snatched from outside her home. Her body was discovered the next morning in the Intercoastal Waterway, weighted down by 2 concrete blocks and strangled with a black sock. For the time, the investigation was massive, involving over 200 interviews and 35 polygraph tests. Each person who took the lie detector test, well, they passed, which paradoxically led investigators into a corner. Forensic teams noted that while the socks used in the first 2 attacks were the same color, they weren't a match set, suggesting the killer had a drawer full of individual socks he was using for the killings. Then, in early 1974, police thought they finally had their man. 19-year-old Gary J. Mattis was arrested for the murder of another woman, and Rob Newman. The evidence against him was compelling. He worked at the exact construction site where Mary Sue Curtis's body was found, and he shared a rare blood-type secretor trait found in only 10% of the population. But the surviving witness from the July attack couldn't pick him out from a lineup, and Mattis had used a silk scarf in his known crime, not a sock. The case for a single serial killer remains a subject of fierce debate. Some family members, including Mary Sue's father, believed it took more than one man to move the heavy concrete blocks used to sink her body. Others theorized that the Gold Sock Killer was merely a sensationalist label created by the media to sell papers during a year when serial killers were dominating the national headlines. Gary J. Mattis was never charged with the sock murders. He was convicted for the Newman case and faded into the prison system, leaving the families of Jonina, Teresa, and Mary Sue with no resolution. Theodore Kelpian, Jonina's husband, famously asked, "Where the hell is the man who killed my wife?" Over 50 years later, that question still echoes through the Florida heat. The gold socks, once a terrifying calling card, are now just evidence in a file that may never be closed. Coconut Grove, Florida, March 5th, 1974. The distance between Amy Billig's home and her father's art gallery was less than a mile. At 12 p.m., the 17-year-old called her dad to borrow $2 for a lunch date with friends at Peacock Park. She was last seen by construction workers hitchhiking near the corner of Main Highway, wearing a denim miniskirt and cork platform sandals. She was a vegetarian, a high stepper with a distinct gait, and a girl who, by all accounts, had no reason to run away. But Amy never made it to the gallery. She vanished into the Florida sunshine, sparking an investigation that would evolve into a 30-year odyssey of psychological torture, biker gang culture, and a mother's refusal to let her daughter become a ghost. The search for Amy was led by her mother, Susan, whose relentless pursuit of the truth became a national symbol of parental devotion. Just 2 weeks after the disappearance, a student found Amy's camera 250 miles north on the Florida Turnpike. The film inside was overexposed, but two blurred images stood out, a light-colored pickup truck and a white van. Then came the tips. Witnesses claimed to have seen Amy with members of the Outlaws and the Pagans, motorcycle gangs that were moving through Miami toward Dayton at the time. One convenience store manager in Orlando reported seeing Amy with two bikers, noting she'd specifically asked for a vegetarian soup, a detail the police had never released to the public. Susan followed these leads all across the country, from Tulsa to Seattle, and even across the Atlantic to England, always arriving just days or hours after a mute, submissive girl matching Amy's description had been moved by the gangs. But while Susan was chasing shadows in the biker world, she was being haunted from within her own city. For 21 years, a man identifying himself as Johnson subjected the Billig family to a campaign of psychological terror. He made hundreds of calls, claiming Amy was being held in a sex ring and describing her abuse in graphic, agonizing detail. In 1995, the FBI finally traced the call to a man named Henry Johnson Blair, a veteran U.S. Customs agent. Detectives found a chilling entry in Amy's diary from before she vanished, mentioning a man named Hank, which was Blair's nickname, who wanted to take her to South America. At the time of the disappearance, Blair was being stationed in Argentina. He owned a white van similar to the one in Amy's photos. Though he was sentenced to 2 years for stalking, Blair denied ever meeting Amy, claiming his calls were the result of alcoholism and OCD. The final and most grim lead surfaced in 1997. Paul Branch, a high-ranking enforcer for the Pagans, made a deathbed confession to his wife. He claimed Amy had been abducted, taken to a trailer in the Everglades, and by 24 members. He said she was injected with drugs until she overdosed and her body was dumped in the swamp. While detectives found the details of the confession compelling, the Billig family eventually came to doubt it, fearing it was a fabrication for money. No remains were ever recovered from the Everglades, but if they were there, well, it's hard to believe they would have ever found anything after all that time. Susan Billig died in 2005, having never found her daughter, but her mission led to the rescue of several other young women held captive by gangs. Today, a meditation garden and a memorial bench in Peacock Park mark the spot where Amy was supposed to have lunch 50 years ago. The case remains officially unsolved, caught between the cruelty of a stalking federal agent and the dark silence of the Florida swamps. Hillsborough County, Florida, September 23, 1986. To the women who loved him, John Charles Jack Lutter was a pillar of stability, a veteran flight engineer for United Airlines with a $60,000 salary. He was a tall, charismatic man who often spoke of his disdain for divorce and his commitment to his faith. Because of his job, his frequent absences were expected. He was simply on a route or in training. But in the summer of 1986, the schedule Jack had maintained for nearly 30 years began to fracture. He vanished from his home in Seattle, leaving his wife, Caroline, in a state of panic. Months later, he resurfaced with a harrowing tale. He claimed he'd been on a charter boat that wrecked in the Caribbean and had been held captive in a Cuban prison. It was a story designed to evoke sympathy, but in actuality, it was a desperate fabrication. While Caroline was mourning him in Washington, Jack was 3,000 miles away, living a perfectly normal life in Hillsborough County, Florida, with a second wife and a different set of children. The Cuban prison, it wasn't the only lie. Investigators soon discovered that Florida was just one hub in a massive interstate web of bigamy and financial exploitation. Jack Lutter didn't just have two families. He had at least 6 and possibly 7 concurrent households across Florida, Washington, California, Colorado, and Texas. He'd fathered approximately 16 children, moving between them with clinical precision. Lutter's methodology was as psychological as it was logistical. He was a social chameleon, adopting the religious identity of whatever woman he was currently courting, claiming to be a devout Catholic to one, a Mormon to the other, and Jewish to the third. He targeted women from male-dominated cultures who were less likely to question a husband's authority or his long business trips. But the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was predatory. Lutter would borrow large sums of money from one wife, citing bad investments, only to use that cash to pay the mortgage for another family in a different state. The system finally collapsed when United Airlines shifted Lutter's flight routes, making his carefully timed domestic visits impossible. As he began missing shifts at his various homes, wives from across the country began calling the airline headquarters in San Francisco. One by one, they discovered they weren't the only women Jack had promised they were. In a hidden cache at his San Francisco condo, one wife found a collection of photos of the other women, the physical evidence of a life lived in a dozen different directions. Lutter was fired from United in 1987 and became a fugitive, eventually being captured at Los Angeles International Airport. Despite the staggering scale of his deception, maintaining 6 condos, 6 houses, and a 50-foot yacht on a single salary, he was charged with only 1 count of bigamy in Washington. He was sentenced to a mere 90 days in jail. But Jack Lutter was a man who knew how to disappear better than most. Shortly after his release, he violated his probation and vanished once again. Today, a warrant for his arrest still remains active, but the man who once spent decades successfully navigating the clouds between his many lives has yet to be found. In Florida and beyond, he left behind a trail of broken families in a mystery that proves sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one in the shadows, but the one sitting at your dinner table. Panama City Beach, Florida, August 12, 1992. Pamela June Ray was a 36-year-old mother of two from Georgia who just wanted to squeeze in one last vacation before school started. She drove through the night from Atlanta, arriving in the Florida Panhandle in the pre-dawn hours of August 12th. But Panama City Beach was full, so Pamela spent an hour moving from motel to motel looking for a vacancy sign. At 5:25 a.m., a police officer on routine patrol saw her standing by her blue Plymouth Sundance, talking to a man in a horizontal striped shirt. Everything seemed normal enough. Minutes later, Pamela locked her 5- and 12-year-old children inside the car for safety, leaving her purse and keys on the seat. Witnesses watched as she walked toward the motel's swimming pool area. Then, the silence of the morning was shattered. Guests in 3 different motels reported hearing a woman's voice screaming, "Help me!" and "Save me!" The cries lasted only moments before vanishing. By 8 a.m., the motel manager found the children asleep in the locked car, awakened only by the rain from a heavy thunderstorm that had swept through the area. But Pamela was gone. The investigation was immediately hampered by the weather. The torrential rain that fell shortly after the screams likely washed away any footprints or biological evidence near the pool. Detectives were left with a vague description of the man in the striped shirt and a haunting mystery. Why would a protective mother leave her children locked in a car and vanish into the dark? Over the years, 2 very different shadows fell over the case. One involved a bizarre financial scandal. Years earlier, a bank had accidentally wired $400,000 into Pamela's father's account. Pamela had been indicted for spending that money, and she was out on bond when she disappeared. While some wondered if she had staged her own disappearance to flee the charges, the violent screams heard by multiple witnesses made that theory hard to swallow. The second shadow was much darker. Mark Reeb, a convicted serial killer already serving life for a 1989 murder, he confessed to snatching Pamela. He claimed he targeted her because of her out-of-state plates, killed her, and dumped her body. Most chillingly, he mentioned that Pamela was carrying a single key in her hand when he grabbed her, a specific habit of hers that wasn't publicly known. However, Reeb later recanted, and a 2019 search of property in Illinois, where his daughter claimed he buried large trash bags, turned up nothing. Justice for Pamela Ray has been a long, frustrating road of false leads and planted evidence. In the early 2000s, a search near Sandy Creek used a cadaver dog whose owner was later caught planting human bones to ensure successful hits, casting doubts on years of forensic work. But the search hasn't stopped. Even as recently as last month, February 24th, 2026, investigators from the Bay County Sheriff's Office and university volunteers began a massive new search of a 20-acre area near Pine Log State Forest. They're acting on a fresh review of evidence, hoping that after 34 years, the Florida soil will finally give up its secret. For Pamela's children, who woke up in a locked car to the sound of rain and a missing mother, the answer remains as elusive as the man in the striped shirt. Belle Glade, Florida, May 1st, 1991. In the sweltering sugarcane fields of Palm Beach County, a mystery was ripening under the Florida sun. That morning, a 911 dispatcher in Miami, 80 miles away, picked up a call from a Spanish-speaking man who sounded terrified. He called himself Antonio. He told the dispatcher that he'd been hunting illegally in a cane field behind a building shaped like a giant ice cream cone when a blue Ford Bronco pulled up into the stalks. 2 men and a young woman stepped out of the vehicle. Antonio watched from the tall grass as an argument erupted over drugs and money. Then he heard the woman's final, desperate plea.
"Ricardito, don't kill me, Ricardito!"
Antonio watched as the man she called Ricardito pulled a machete and struck her repeatedly. He saw the 2 men drag her body into the brush before fleeing in the Bronco. He even caught a glimpse of the license plate. It had a 7 and a 2. Detectives used Antonio's description of the ice cream cone building to find the Twisty Treat restaurant in Belle Glade. A mile south of that shop, in a thick tree line, they found the remains of 21-year-old Rebecca Young Davis. She'd been dead for at least a week, her body already beginning to mummify in the Florida heat. Despite the decomposition, investigators managed to pull a single thumbprint from her right hand to confirm her identity. Rebecca's life had been defined by a cycle of violence. Her own mother had been murdered when Rebecca was only 12, and by 21, she was trapped in a life of drugs and prostitution, coerced by a boyfriend who frequently robbed her clients. Investigators cleared the boyfriend as a suspect, but they believe his habit of ripping off drug dealers unknowingly put a target on Rebecca's back. To Ricardito, she wasn't a person, she was a debt that needed to be settled. 3 weeks after the discovery, police thought they had their man. They detained a local individual who'd been bragging to a prostitute about killing a woman. When a deputy pulled him over for a suspected DUI, the man didn't wait for questions. He immediately blurted out that he knew Detective Frank Mayo wanted to talk to him about a murder, even though the detective hadn't mentioned it yet. It was a massive red flag, but the moment he was brought in for questioning, he invoked his right to an attorney and shut down. Without physical evidence or a witness to place him in that field, well, they had to let him go. The investigation into the murder of Rebecca Davis is currently frozen by a single missing link, Antonio. Law enforcement believes he was a Cuban immigrant who fled the scene out of fear, likely worried his illegal hunting would lead to his deportation. They've made it clear Antonio isn't a suspect. He's the only person alive who saw Ricardito holding that machete. Today, the blue Ford Bronco and the men inside it are the ghosts of the Glades. Rebecca's family still waits for the man from that payphone to finish the story he started 35 years ago. Until then, her case remains one of Florida's most brutal and silent mysteries. Key West, Florida, December 2000. Colleen Suzie Wood was a 53-year-old mother of 2 who moved to Florida to chase a dream of living on the water. In late 1999, she answered a personal ad looking for a sailing companion. The man behind that ad was John Paul Sr., a former professional race car driver who presented himself as a wealthy Harvard graduate. Suzie was smitten. Within months, she sold her condo, gave Paul over $40,000 to invest, and moved onto his 55-foot schooner, the Island Girl. On December 13, 2000, Suzie called a coworker from a bar in Key West. She was in great spirits, excited for a 5-year global sailing tour Paul had planned, but it was the last time anyone would hear her voice. When Suzie failed to show up for her office Christmas party, her family began a frantic search. They eventually tracked down John Paul Sr., but his story never added up. In fact, he gave 3 different versions of her departure. For example, he told Suzie's son that she'd left with a football player boyfriend. He told his own daughter she left because of an ex-girlfriend. Finally, he told detectives they had a massive fight over money, and she returned with 2 hulking men to retrieve her things. But while Paul was telling these stories, Susie's bank account was being bled dry. Between December and February, nearly $40,000 was withdrawn via 80 separate ATM transactions. Surveillance footage didn't show Paul at the machines. Instead, it showed two unidentified women. When caught, they confessed that a man named John had paid them a commission to withdraw the cash using Susie's cards and pins. Detectives soon discovered that John Paul Sr.'s wealthy racer persona was a thin veil over a violent criminal history. He was a convicted drug trafficker and had served time for shooting a federal witness several times. More disturbingly, Suzie wasn't the first woman to vanish from his life. In 1981, his wife, Chalice Paul, had also disappeared in Key West. Paul claimed he simply left her there, and like Suzie, she was never seen again. But before he could be charged, John Paul Sr. did what he did best. He raced away. In the summer of 2001, he skipped parole, sailed the Island Girl out of Florida waters, and vanished. He renamed the boat the Diamond Girl and has since been spotted in Fiji, Italy, and Thailand. In 2004, an acquaintance in Fiji managed to smuggle a laptop off Paul's boat and get it to the FBI. Forensic teams confirmed it was Suzie Wood's computer. Today, John Paul Sr. remains a fugitive, believed to be hiding in Southeast Asia or the Netherlands. Suzie Wood is officially listed as endangered and missing. But for those who know the history of the man on the Island Girl, the reality is much darker. Florida's turquoise waters are beautiful, but they're deep enough to hide the secrets of a man who spent his life outrunning the law and the women he left in his wake. Florida is a land of sunlight and reinvention, but as these 6 stories show, the brightness often casts the longest shadows. From the gold socks of Broward County to the silent coves of the Everglades, the truth in the Sunshine State is frequently buried deep beneath the sand and the surf. The files remain open, and the search for justice continues. This is Southern Crimes.